Yeah. So, hi everyone. My name is Joost Vervoort. I'm an associate professor of foresight and anticipatory governance at the Copernicus Institute of Sustainable Development at the Utrecht University. I'm a colleague of Maarten's, and Maarten and I work together on lots of interesting things. And I'm also the work package leader on evaluation for the Creatures program. Sorry, Simon, I'm just going to mute you, if that's okay. I can't actually. Can you mute yourself, maybe, if you're on the phone? Yeah, I don't know if he hears that, but anyway, and we've invited Maarten because Maarten's work has been very inspiring for creatures. And Maarten is a professor at Utrecht University and leads the Urban Futures Studio and has a lot of wonderful work related to futures and how future imaginaries work and different ideas about and different projects related to imagining more hopeful futures. And Maarten is today, he's here to talk with us about situationist politics, and especially in the context of sustainable futures. Yeah, so Maarten, do you want to get started?
Sure. So pleasure to be in your midst, some familiar faces and lots of new people. I want to share some thoughts with you that, let's see. I can't see. What do you see? Do you see my PowerPoint now? Eh?
Now we see your desktop, yeah.
So it is part of sort of a broader project. While I'm looking for the slides, it's part of a broader project where together with Jeroen Omen and the others of the Urban Future Studio, we sort of rethink how a more radical type of futuring could impact on the thinking of about the sustainability transition, and that is born in a frustration with how the confinement of our thinking and about environmental politics. And I in this talk this now you see my slides, right?
Yes.
In this talk, what I would like to do is very quickly go through a sort of a critique of environmental politics, and then take a broad step out, because sort of if you really want to get to a different perspective on environmental politics beyond, say, technological innovation, transition sort of thinking, then you need to both in time step back further, and also in terms of your orientation step out further, so zoom out further. And I use the situationists for that purpose. And as Superflux is sort, as I understood, part of your consortium, I thought that I could start with that wonderful sort of installation that was just floating around on the internet and social media, a refuge for resurgence, because I suppose this is what you now typically hear people say. So there is we require a fundamental shift in our discourse, and we can't separate that from rethinking, well, the table at which decisions are being made. So the whole idea about sort of the citizen council in Ireland or in France and so forth are of course connected to opening up the system that is unable to do sort of the fundamental rethinking that many of us deem necessary. But my take on this is looking at it through the double lens of discourse and narrative, which I think doesn't need to be elaborated, I suppose. I mean, I would, if you want me to, I will. But the sort of that there is a power of narrative in showing alternatives and making people aspire to them, so that narrative has this capacity to engage people and make them imagine different worlds. But I increasingly think that cannot be analyzed without also taking into account the political dramaturgies within which that narrative is shared and also staged. So political dramaturgies are then the art of making making drama and it's and prop making drama and prop and enacting it properly on the stage by means of composition and representation. And so very broad brush definition of political dramaturgy. And oh God, so there are in my perspective then always four dimensions that you would analyze. So you can analyze who says what, as the persons, the actors, actors in the sense of an organization, how things are said, the discourses they employ, or the frames, if a bit more confined and often more instrumental in the way in which it is used, where discourse can be unconscious, that people use language without being aware of it. Where things are being said, so the stages, the sites, locations, and also the mise en scène of these stages. It can be a parliament, it can be a press conference, and many variations of that. And to whom things are being said. So there is, and I think in the sort of STS literature, a lot of interesting thinking over the last sort of 25 years that I mean, don't assume an audience, you create a public. That is the differentiation. And of course, by saying things in a particular way and on a particular location, you create a public if you do it well. And that public will then in itself be an actor to further a particular transformation potentially. Now, as I said, I will do this very quickly. I think that there is this dramaturgy that have called Cockpitism in environmental politics. And please correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it is pretty dominant even also in academics, because we then start to analyze the cockpit. And what you would then typically hear, it's 10 years to save the planet, or Ernst von Weizsäcker, we can reduce the resource load with a factor 10, or enhance the resource efficiency with a factor 10. Is a typical language for the cockpit, and it's staged with always this picture coming back, and it is amplified by Johan Rockström, who has sort of course summarized sort of what is it, 10,000 articles in the peer-reviewed literature in this visual, because a visual works better. And of course he then uses the stage of a TED talk with a different sort of rock star type clothing to amplify his message. Or if you're not able as an academic to fulfill that, you ask somebody else to speak on your behalf in a political setting, like in this case. Now, my little engagement with that circus, of course, and not nearly as prominent, that was in my past job, and that dramaturgy for an academic is then handing over reports to people who are allegedly in power, and they then just thank you very much, and that's it. And but they always say, and that's then the dramaturgy of it as well, that there's a difference between policy relevant and policy prescriptive. And people, if you want to be influential in this dramaturgy, you have to stick to that. However, are you then influential? You're close to the alleged power of the cockpit, but you say things in a way that is not amplifying a message. So what I did in the last couple of years, and that's where the little excerpt is at the bottom right, I started to not use that differentiation. So when we had a press conference in Nairobi on a food systems report, and it showed once again that we were on a highway to disaster. And the journalist asked the question, "Are you saying that we should no longer eat meat?" Then, of course, the policy relevant frame would say that that's not up to me, that's up to the politicians. And I said yes. And then, of course, it was in 400 newspapers, and But of course, so you do something with dramaturgy, and it spikes in the attention. But by and large, people don't do that. They stick to the implicit or explicit, in this case, dramaturgy of environmental politics with that science policy interface. And I think what I and this is of course then the grave demand on our time to contribute to these. And if you want to have tenure track, you want to be a lead author, etc. And that's all in our work now. And I use the privilege of the Urban Future Studio to try and imagine new radical dramaturgies, and those would then be dramaturgies that expose the contradictions of the status quo, and by doing so create publics and spur them into action. And I hope that's what you're doing, and hopefully I can say a few things that get us into an interesting conversation. Now, talking about a radical dramaturgy, this is Donald Pols, the leader of Milieudefensie in the Netherlands. He just won a case against Shell, as you probably know, and that's the first sort of case where, based on the Paris Agreement, their additional dramaturgy, you could say, of bringing that to court has led to an incredible problem for the fossil industry, I suppose, because Shell won't be the only one. So he organized that definitely in a different dramaturgy of the court, and that is really stunning in its effect. However, I'm not going to talk about that because I think it's pushing it too far to bring that under the umbrella of the Situationist. So let me now step back to look at the Situationist International, which was a very small group of artists that were very close to social theory. So Henri Lefebvre was very influential to this group. There were many sort of personal friendships between architects, artists, academics, French, British, Dutch, Swiss in particular. And one of the leading figures was Guy Debord, of course. The Society of Spectacle was in itself an influential text. And it was a very small group, but you see in our if you see how often it is picked up, there is something in what they did that was a very powerful at that time, and apparently also still of interest, according to many, including myself. Now, to understand that, you have to step one back further still, and I still do this exercise to regain an angle on environmental politics. And you have to, because they had this big controversy with the modernists, Le Corbusier in particular. And so if you read the authentic documents of Corbusier, it is indeed stunning what he wrote. So the mindset, the modern town planning comes to the birth with a new architecture by this immense step in evolution, so brutal and so overwhelming, we burn our bridges and break with the past. So the presidentism was all over the place. So the idea was really that the new technology, the new innovation of building with concrete and steel and having the possibility of functionalist architecture was a major step forward. And there he was, of course, and the modern architects were really also close to the futurists, and also in their language. And I'm not saying that that language is still with us, but what I found so interesting is that interaction between artists and the practice of building better cities, social democratic politicians building a better city, was so direct. So I can't read these all, but it's one big ecstasy about speed and about the possibility of burning bridges with the past, and even, of course, with very nasty attitudes, both to women and to anything that was sort of historically created before them. Could dwell on this for long, but it's more important to see that imaginary that was sort of created in the world of arts and culture after the First World War and in the 1920s, stuck with us for 100 years. So, and that is, of course, again, thinking about the power of an imaginary and this sort of stuff. That, I mean, these photos were taken to glorify what they achieved, and not to show how well, not to show how ultimately unlivable it was. André Breton was quick to say, well, this is a disaster. So modernist functionalism is the most unhappy dream of the collective unconscious, the solidification of desire in a most violent and cruel automatism. So what was deemed the essence and the quality by one was criticized by the other. Now come the situationist, and the situationist did something which I found politically and in terms of activism very interesting. They did not sort of face this modernist discourse, and of course with its many institutional forms, head on, but they used things like irony, twists, reroutings of the discourse to expose for an audience its violence, basically. And one key term that they used was détournement, which I think is a fantastic idea. So rerouting of pre-existing elements to create a new performative. And so you have a commercial space for advertisements, and you put something else in it instead. And actually, there's still activists using precisely this tool, which was something of the early 1960s. Another word they used was situations. So the idea that politics changes not through the science policy interface and that people read the scientific report, but by exposing something that is wrong in a particular situation, and often urban, not always, as I will show later on. So here is a case in Amsterdam. Amsterdam was really deeply influenced by the situationists, in particular Provo, and Provo was sort of the local manifestations of the hippie movement, but also with close relations to Constant Nieuwenhuis, the artist that was a key figure in the Situationist International. And what they here did was basically walk around or dance around a statue that was given to the city by the cigarette industry, and they sought to expose the corruption by doing it. It was completely non-violent, but it created lots of police response, and precisely that was what exposed, I suppose, the hypocrisy of the system or so forth, and was very effective in making things, opening things up for discussion. And a third term they used was drift, and drift was a correction to the geometrical approach to the city that modernists had, with the functionalist layout of recreation, dwelling, and mobility, and work. And what Guy Debord and Oscar Jorn did, they walked through Paris and cut out the bits of Paris where they said, this is an interesting public space where working class cultures are still lived. So rather than, looking about dwellings and so forth, they looked at, say, the social ecology or the anthropology of the city. And finally, a term that they used was unitary urbanism. And so the idea not to have these separations of functions in different parts of the city, but to have everything together in, say, basically what urban life, according to Sennett and so forth, makes so wonderful. And in that context, they cut also ownership. So the point was with this white bike, they wanted to have 20,000 white bikes in Amsterdam so that nobody would have a bike of his own. So no locks, and they donated their own bikes. And well, obviously it took then, quite some time before we now have these shared bikes all over the place, but on a commercial basis, of course. That's then, of course, the tragedy of it. Now, one step in the direction of environmental politics, of course, is the question, if we talk about this transition, we often talk about a just transition, the need to combine getting out of fossils with issues of social fairness and justice and equity. But you can also think about, okay, do we really make that shift to a post-rational city? Do we take into account that cultural critique that the situationists brought to the fore? And there I'm not so sure. So my worry is that just transitions is very much on the table, but that cultural dimension is sort of underappreciated also because of the technocratic tendency in environmental science and in environmental policy making. Now, what this is an image of Constant Nieuwenhuis, who was the inventor of New Babylon, which was complete separation um, of the world of the modern architects. That, of course, if you live in Britain, I mean, these estates, they are with us to stay, but they are, of course, a sort of a nightmarish idea of a utopian future. And what Constant did, and that's actually very profound. There's a few interviews with him, unfortunately only in Dutch, but on YouTube. He anticipated the possibility of automatization. And but the interesting thing was, and therefore it's still so topical, I think, that he combined that with a utopia of people using that for their collective purpose. So not to reduce the cost of a product or to amplify the profit of a firm, but to use automatization to liberate people and to give that expression in New Babylon was a way, of course, to try and enhance its scope on the imagination of others. What is it all about? Is it to own a car? Is it to be able to move around more quickly? This is at the time, of course, that these cities were completely full of newly owned private cars, and everything came to a standstill. And they connected it immediately to this issue of ownership. Of course, I had a critique also of the idea that people had to move in and out because of that separation and not going for the unitary urbanism that they were in favor of. And of course, I suppose that that sort of wrong type of rationalist city is still with us. If you think about how people use, well, this is obviously nobody wants, but in, I suppose, environmental politics, you also see a tendency often to think that smart city technology is a part of the solution without taking into account that cultural dimension that they uh, uh, thought was so important. Now here's a little clip. I won't play it, but it's ironizing the that suggestion um, of smart city proponents that actually solves problems. And of course, these days we get more sort of uh, reports on people crashing with self-driving cars than anything else. And it's definitely clear that in the inner cities, self-driving vehicles can only have it their way if we would really reduce the space for pedestrians and bicycles. So there's absolutely no way that within the confines of a unitary urbanism where everything is taking place at the same place and there is no separation of fast traffic and slow traffic, that self-driving vehicles can have a future. So I mean, I'm looking very much at signals that is what is in the making, suggesting that in order for smart cities to work, the rights of pedestrians or bicycles have to be reduced, which would be, of course, entirely opposite of how the situationists would have thought about a utopian future. Now, in that overbuilt city that Constant imagined, there were no private homes anymore, but people would move around in a palace with 1,000 rooms. And so in that sense, it was quite an anti-bourgeois sort of suggestion, thinking about a utopian reality.
Can I just ask everyone to mute, please? Thank you. I see a few people are unmuted. Just check yourself and please mute. Okay, thank you.
So from modernist rationalism, that should have read, they wanted to move to a social ecology of the city. And I think that focus raises a question for environmental politics too. So we can discuss that later on. If there is not a dominant sort of modernist rationalism in ecological modernization, or what discourse you would label you would describe it. And what would it make it different if you would focus, as the situations suggested, on the social ecology? And then, of course, the question is, how do you get that sort of perspective? Uh, hey, why is it stuck? Okay. Now here you see these overlays that he made also on maps. This is Amsterdam, where the suggestion of these. So he imposed that new Babylon logic on the cities, of course, completely sort of fictional. But there was, again, interesting that it was not just in the arts, it was also architects. So Smithson's with the cluster city, and this was actually built. It's a monument, modern monument, where you see that the language that they used about structures, urban structures, were first very similar in the visual arts as it was in architecture and the built environment. Now, and here, of course, you see sort of the typical situationist critique of how people are, dominated. I mean, there is a politics of the imagination. I don't need to point out in your group. But now I'm moving finally to ecological matters. What I find so interesting and food for thought is that the situation is started with the idea that play was dominant. So taking from Huizinga, the historian, homo ludens. So the idea that rather than it had to be functional, or if for that matter, had to be ecologically sound, they said that no, life has to be central in it, and led to this sort of images of a new organization of life with people, on ladders, and that led then later to that incredibly big New Babylon, which I mean, it's almost inevitable that you've seen it either in the MoMA or at Biennales. It's always some pavilion has these a New Babylon references in it. So it's for architects and designers, it's really powerful sort of trope. Now, what I try to show is that this sort of way of using irony, social and cultural critique as a tool may be also interesting for us in the environmental field. Now, here's an example which I just got from Twitter the other day, where there is a crossing, and it led to so many accidents that they put these little flags. So people who are pedestrians are supposed to take this little flag and then say, "Well, hey, I'm a pedestrian. I'm trying to cross. Don't hit me with your car." But somebody then decided that that was so nonsensical that she made a car-sized flag and started to walk up and down, so to sort of critique the disbalance of power. We did it in our own little way in the Urban Future Studio with creating a museum of the linear economy, which contained all sort of objects that in 2050 are sort of irony laden sort of objects of that past that we completely overcame. And the students actually in another mixed classroom, and it had nothing to do with COVID. This was 3 years ago. They said, probably because of the environmental issue, it will be so crowded that you need to have a commuter suit. And this commuter suit was to survive in public transport with these sort of tools. And also there was a sort of, I thought, a very interesting sort of take to, you could say, détournement. Unfortunately, when we sort of lightly tried if we could make photos on the station or even enter the trains with it, that is of course completely forbidden by National Rail, and therefore the impact of it as a happening wasn't tried. And this also in the Place of Hope exhibition we did is a almost direct reference to the Situationists, who had as one of their claims the beach under the pavement, and we had this whole sort of nature reserve in the basement of an exhibition space in the middle of the city. And Jess and I are still working on a paper on this, but the interesting thing is that you say, well, okay, that's so interesting, but the many people that came down that stairs and started to cry I still sort of, for us, a puzzle. So the fact that it was so completely, they were so completely taken by surprise by seeing suddenly the midst of nature at a place that they didn't expect it, that led to really deep emotional engagement with an exhibition that was really low cost, but still, had that effect, and probably is politically interesting. Now, and the parade with which we started that day, I suppose, also is in itself a sort of situationist uh, move, because what we did, we used the iconography of a demonstration. This was in 2018, so no climate for future yet. And so these young students that walked in the march really said, well, what is this? What these placards? What is that for? They had not, like older people, this recollection of the 1970s and 1980s, and that you knew that you could have collective power by walking in the street with a relatively small group. That was for them new. Of course, now they know and they have their own sort of new iconography for it. But we twisted it. So rather than the usual negative statements, we only had positive statements, so like appetite in the future, place of hope, and so forth. Make land, not war. And so we twisted the meaning and walked through that city center as a sort of an happening experiment situation. Now, these are a few images that I took just to open up the discussion. This is Extinction Rebellion, which I follow with great interest, but I think could learn a lot from the Situationists, because this is, of course, you could say, okay, the power, male power and female passive resistance in an image shows a sort of injustice. And if you then don't wear clothes, it's perhaps even more obvious, a differentiation. But I think this is much more powerful and speaks much more to the heart of that situationist approach to environmental politics, because what they do here, and this is a long time ago in the Tate already, and so what they expose is the fundamental wrong of having a temple for the most respected bits of art being supported by BP in this particular case, which undercuts with its product the civilization it sponsors. And so that this is, of course, a true happening, in the sense that it in a particular location does an exercise that is impactful and, of course, mediagenic, a spectacle in itself. This also, I thought, was a very, very clever situationist protest. Why? Because people don't know these machines. So we assume that electricity comes from the socket, but here Extinction Rebellion, all in white, on the level of that incredibly big machine, created images that showed many people for the first time, I'm sure, a visual of that energy actually is mined and with machines that are coming from Planet of the Apes. Now a third, and I have 4 examples, then I stop, is Arthur van Baanen. Is a Dutch artist who does interesting work to support people who use the street as a stage, because a street demonstration in itself is not enough in a mediatized society. But what he sort of uses are inflatables, and here they play, but then they suddenly arrange them as a barricade. So creating these new images of power, which of course is sort of ironic, but in terms of being expressivist, it's interesting. And when you see these sort of exercises, it's really interesting to see when the state thinks it is appropriate to use violence, and sort of why was it that people peacefully demonstrating in 1960s Amsterdam were all taken off the street? Why is it that in certain choreographies, Extinction Rebellion is taken off the street and not in others? Probably there is something to be learned from that. Okay, so to conclude and open up, so what this exercise is about is I'm looking for ways to sort of strengthen the register, enrich the register of environmental politics by bringing back to the fore that idea that it is also about cultural politics. And I do that because I think that the dominant register is too close to the cockpit and therefore doesn't zoom out enough to really regain a perspective on the epistemologies we implicitly use. And by doing that, relating that, I suppose that is something you discuss too in your project. One but final slide, radical dramaturgy. So what are the questions that I have for you? And I'm interested to hear. What are the alternative sides of politics? I mean, the legal obviously is very powerful, the financial world, we see lots of happening, but what could happen in the public space in a way that is really having traction on systemic change and not only on, say, technological solutions for the environment, but also on that cultural critique on modernism that's still so much with us. Now, is there such a thing as a situationist environmental politics even now? And what could détournement mean for environmental politics? And obviously, I already gave a few examples thereof. And this is the final slide. So is it logic to think more about values than to think about facts? How can you expose violence that is implicit in the ecological crisis and its management? I mean, a smart city is, I think, a violent proposition that may reduce emissions, but it is violent in its spatial expression. And finally, and I think that's really powerful, and I couldn't touch on these images, it's often very potent, I think, to use these sort of creative processes to show the absurdity of the present. And so we have a focus on the future as a nightmare, limits to growth and prophecies of doom. And people say, well, you know, perhaps it's not that bad, the present. But to show the absurdity of how we eat and what we eat and how we think about happiness, I think may also be a catalyst of change that with such a situationist approach, you could bring out much better. So I'm really interested to hear what you have to say. It's for me a new sort of presentation that I share with you for the first time.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Thanks, Maarten. Excellent. So those are some really provocative questions. Yeah, I wonder if anyone would like to respond to Maarten's challenges there and his questions. And we can open up the conversation. We still have some good time left for that. Everyone's very excited about your presentation in the chat, Maarten, so that's nice. I think that raising your hands on Zoom is also possible, or drop a question in the chat, and maybe we should just drop a question in the chat, and then we'll get you to speak up. You don't have to write it in full, just like a sentence or something, and I'll ask you to speak. Yeah, I just wanted to say, while people are thinking about questions, Maarten, that the questions that you raised, those last couple of questions, are they're extremely relevant to the Creatures program as well. Questions about values were very much focused on how do we engage with value transformations, with creative practices, and the questions about the absurdity of the present and sort of exposing violence. Yeah, that's really powerful to sort of bring out the politics and the lock-ins that we're caught in. Yeah, I see that. Anne, do you want to maybe respond? I see you already put in some comments.
Well, I mean, I enjoyed this so much, and I'm afraid that just manifested in a list of side notes rather than a question. But one of the things we were doing this morning was talking about our themes. And at the moment, it feels like your question about kind of like, how do we understand the sort of this is a cultural phenomenon rather than a series of elements, kind of also speaks to some of the questions that we're asking, is that how do you actually make transformation that's meaningful at a small collective level or an individual level? How does that then relate to the bigger systems that are being changed? So I wondered if you've been thinking about that. I wouldn't, we're hesitating to call it scale because it seems to be much more complex and entangled, really, and scale is just not always the useful metaphor. But do you have some advice for us in this area?
So I'm puzzled by the fact that some of these symbolic, or the acts of symbolic politics can be so powerful, because they, and that's of course De Boer's point also. The Society of the Spectacle was not really about left-wing politics. It was about capitalism and masterminding the spectacle. But of course, you can learn from that logic, and that, I suppose that's what the Situationists did. And so to ironize power is sometimes so threatening to those in power that it leads to a response that makes people question, was it that important? So and that's different from trying to face power head on. So the case of the provost in the 1960s was a case in point where the government had to rethink how it related to the tobacco industry. And it was, in terms of the intensity of that happening, bizarre that could be so powerful. So there is something in not facing power head on, like in a trade union sort of approach, but using the cultural vocabulary and dramaturgy to show the contradictions in the powerful, and in particular in moral and ethical terms, that makes that into a really important element of a transformation. So the fact that that case is now won, the divestment movement, I suppose, comes from environmental activists, but the initial mediatized reports were about these sort of situationist exercises. It was only later that it was taken to the boards of the universities, and but so the fact that now the whole sort of cultural top layer has had to disabandon that sponsorship from fossil industry. Was, I think, because it became manifest, partly due to the situationist exercises, that you can't be in charge of legacy of civilization, or whatever you want to call it, and be supported by an industry that doesn't give a toss about our collective future.
Thank you. And I think that it's really interesting. Sorry. Really interesting that then it's not just about getting people to change their practice or try and put power on through political entities, but it's actually encouraging people to be mischievous and to actually express that creative side and work in oblique ways, and that doesn't have to be something that only rebels do, but it might be that we all become rebels then. Yeah. Okay, thank you. I'll pipe down now. Someone else has got their hand up.
Yeah. Thanks. And yeah, I see that, and thanks, Christina, for pointing it out. For some reason, the hands appeared a little bit late for me, but Irina and Paul, I would give Irina the floor first and then Paul.
Cool. Thank you so much, Maarten. I am really curious to hear your take on the sort of in creatures we've been discussing a lot, the kind of the idea of looking at socially engaged or socio-ecologically engaged creative practices in art from like Pablo Helgueras and others who analyze it from like symbolic and actual value that they kind of create or make or bring about. And if you're thinking much through those, because we've been speaking a lot about the symbolic value and meaning, I think, and if the category of the actual value comes through much for you in your work. And in that also, if you have any thoughts on or work with also Rancière's ideas of like this metapolitics and that idea of these kind of practices, ability to speak twice, both from the space of the kind of autonomous realm of like that experience that creates, but also that being life and politics itself. Sorry, that got a bit twisted in the end, but hopefully you can make something of that question.
Yeah, so what we sort of focusing on is how do imaginaries or images of the future stick, and also how can you loosen them and get them replaced with alternative images of both the present and the future. And so the entry point is that how does an imagination of self and your preferred future, your aspirational future, how does that come about, and how is it reproduced, and how can you sort of bring twists in that? And I can't give full answers to the question about what the role of the arts here in particular is. I'm just struck by the fact that we pay so little attention to it, whereas if you look at the, as I said, the sort of the state responses, it seems that they are up to something. Otherwise, you would ignore them, right? You would just let it go. And what is it that makes it stick? And it is very subtle. So Extinction Rebellion, sometimes they also, for instance, invoke the costumes of the Handmaid's Tale. Eh? So the sort of a suggestion of indexicality, that you can sort of bring that symbolism of that text to the situation, and that people would then understand that this is about suppression and oppression. But I'm not, so that needs to be looked into. Why was that not more than just an image? It didn't catch on. What did catch on were actual pretending to be dead on the square, right? So it was there. I suppose it is the disruptive element that did catch people, perhaps in their bad consciousness about driving a vehicle, and being upset about people that expose that in their face, so to say. So, but that needs to be analyzed, which languages work and with what sort of mechanism. So it's more a research agenda. And so the last question I can't really answer because I haven't got that text handy to respond on it in a profound way.
Thanks, Maarten. Paul, go ahead.
Oh, there we go. Zoom challenges, and that kind of illustrates my point. I think, I mean, I kind of want to riff a bit on what Anne was saying, as well as on your talk, and as well as on a talk I'm currently writing to give this afternoon. And your use of the Situationists and Debord is very on point, and it's really interesting to hear someone in your position quoting the Situationists. That's a thing I sometimes see in sort of like obscure social theory seminars, but not this sort of stuff. And that seems to be that's an interesting and exciting weak signal. But I guess, I kind of want to look at the dark flip side of that briefly, not to undermine your point, but to kind of deepen it and take it onwards. Because the bits of Debord that I'm quoting in my own talk this afternoon are from the comments on the Society of the Spectacle, where he talks about the spectacle's ability to recuperate critique and to absorb even what seems to be in opposition to it. And this is kind of picked up, though not necessarily from the same source, in Mark Fisher's critiques of capitalist realism, right? The relentless ability that capitalism has to absorb critique and essentially start selling critiques of itself back to us. Mm-hmm. And I think what's interesting about a lot of the examples you used is how they were probably at their most effective when seen in person, right? And I think what I'm getting at here is for this sort of stuff to to really get operationalized, it needs to be wedded to a theory of media. We need to really understand how that recuperation of the image and the act gets caught up by the same infrastructural system of systems, which not only does the extraction and provides our consumption, but mediates our experience of the consequences for that consumption, that mediates our notions of what those companies are about, right? You know, we don't have, those actions can be performed, but how they are retransmitted and shared and framed is beyond the control of the people doing the actions. And so kind of getting a grip on how image and action is picked up and recirculated and reproduced by infrastructures of mediation might enable the design of stuff that cuts through more effectively. I wonder if you could speak to any particular examples that you've mentioned today, or others that you haven't in that light.
Yeah, no, hi Paul. So no, you're absolutely right that that capacity to absorb these alternatives is massive, and that makes it even more complex. But I suppose the whole interaction between the physical engagement and its mediatic representation, I mean, is now different. But it was, of course, I mean, in the also 1960s. If your demonstration isn't reported in the newspaper, it hasn't taken place. That is the same source. So and to figure out that logic, I suppose, is very, very interesting. And the fact that we now have that capability of constantly filming and ourselves in that situation and sharing. I mean, that is something that I suppose was making Fridays for Future a very big movement. It was, I mean, the timelines of anybody was completely overwhelmed by images of young people enjoying a demonstration and seeing that they were more than an individual. I mean, I read it as basic as that. So that the collective life was not only on the festival, it could also be about collective will formation. Revisited, of course, in Black Lives Matter. I mean, the return of collective action on the street, but then in a spectralized version, not with this, as I say, trade union, we want 1% more wage. No, getting at the statues. And it is, of course, not always on the progressive side. So the yellow jerseys in Paris, very clever, right? So to have the jersey that everybody has, that's practical, but also the jersey of alarm. And to wear that, I mean, that is using the symbolism that fits to collective action on the streets. And I suppose the French always have that in they're born with it. And I suppose if the Situationists would have lived now, they would have taken on that media echo element as part of their situations. But I'm looking at it and trying to understand either is it effective in showing the absurdity of the present? Is it convincing in the amorality or the hypocrisy of the status quo? And I suppose also that's why I found these rural examples so interesting, that it shows that we sort of knew but never wanted to see. I mean, why is it that these machines have only become mediatized over the last 10 years? They were never in the media. These horrendous machines that dig away whole villages in Germany. It's just, they're literally 2 kilometers over the Dutch border. And so to use that power of a demonstration to spectacleize something which is indeed spectacular, I thought that was very clever and leading, I suppose, in a way, but I haven't researched it at all, to problematizing something that was always implicitly there.
Thanks, Maarten. I see a question and a comment. Chris asks, has a question about Joanna Macy, and I don't know if how much you know about Joanna Macy's work, Maarten, but maybe Chris, can you elaborate a little bit before we go into the question? If you're still there,
Yeah.
Yes. Oh, there you go.
Yeah, I'm here, and I just it seemed to me that there are multiple, that in a way the challenge is not just the detour, is as you kind of suggested, that there are different dimensions to the challenge, and I just find Joanna Macy's construction of the idea that there are holding actions, defending actions, there are Gaian structures, examples of doing things differently, and that all of this requires shifts of consciousness, as quite a good way to think about this problem in the roundedness of it. Because in a way, I mean, it's interesting. There's a program in the UK at the moment called Landscape Decisions, funded by our Natural Environment Research Council. And a couple of artists did a presentation on beautiful disruption recently, and they assembled a really interesting list of ways that artists have engaged disruptively with our thinking about environmental issues. And some of them were, and then the other, so the most practical example of the Joanna Macy thing for me is, maybe there's an organization in Glasgow called the Galgale Trust. What happened was they wanted to build a motorway through a public park, and so a bunch of activists created something called the Pollock Free State, and they inhabited the trees, and they did all of this, and they lost eventually, and the motorway was built through the park. But then they turned around and they said, we showed you what we don't want, now we're going to show you what we do want. And they established the Galgale Trust, which teaches people how to build boats in one of the most impoverished neighborhoods in Glasgow. It's a program of reinvestment in the community. And I love that idea. There are not many examples where people go, we've shown you what we don't want, now we need to show you what we do want.
Yeah. So I think what we all sort of seem to be intrigued by is this, where this sort of social sciences and art start to sort of blur, and so what is that the language of the arts allows for that people indeed can tap into their feelings about the future. So that boat is as a metaphor for something, I'm sure. And so when we did that Places of Hope, sort of we didn't have a theory about it. We just got at it. But there were several installations that we thought were, expressions, sort of an overlay of an IPCC report, but were completely different. They were not overlays. That's how we designed them, or that was the brief we gave the designers. But people had a much more direct relationship to that. And what struck me was that the intermediate language that we use, CO2 parts per million, fossil fuels, that is so cognitive and assumes so much sort of educational approaches to it, that we have forgotten that things like nature, boat, soil, water, tap into an emotional part of your brain that made people in that exhibition really say, well, now we have the feeling that we can meaningfully discuss about the future and overcome the ecological crisis. I mean, I thought, wait a minute, this is just this is just the exhibition. But so that and I think that so the deeper categories, so the re-emergence in discourse of the forest or the tree, I think speaks to precisely that again. And we in environmental policy talk about biomass. I mean, not that you can't relate to it. So perhaps that what I'm saying is that in environmental discourse, it has become so technocratic that it is impossible to create a larger following of people pushing for it. But on the other side, I think it has been created because there's also a policy elite that wants to control that agenda. So that can be meaningfully researched, I suppose. And I hope that you're doing part of that.
Thanks so much, Maarten. We're a few minutes over time, so I'd like to wrap it up. Thanks for a wonderful conversation, for great ideas, Maarten, and for great questions from everyone. I just wanted to say that the next seminar is on the 29th of June, and that will be with Laura Pereira. And Laura is a global leader when it comes to transformative pathways and scenarios around biodiversity and food systems, and she's done some really excellent work sort of strengthening bottom-up futures in the space of global assessments, and especially her recent work focuses on different conceptions of the relationships between humans and nature in future scenarios and pathways. So hopefully see you then. Check the Creatures website for details, and thanks again, everyone. Thanks again, Maarten. It's always a pleasure to have you, and hopefully see everyone next time.
Okay.
Bye.
Hey, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.